Thank you for the kind introduction and for having me here at the University Club, and also for showing up today and taking time out of your busy schedules to come and hear me talk about something that's very near and dear to me, as you'll see as I go through the presentation. So the title of my talk today is simply Rethinking Crime and Immigration. And let me just step back before I start speaking about immigration to talk a little bit about crime, nationally and also in California. Now, most Americans actually believe that crime in the U.S. is worsening and has been worsening. Witness the results of a national Gallup poll that was conducted in October of 2011. This was a question on the poll that asked Americans, is there more crime in the U.S. than there was a year ago or less? And you also had the option of answering or the same. And as you can see from the dark green line up at the top, the majority of Americans believe and have continued to believe that the nation's crime problem is getting worse, and they have so for the past decade. And specifically in 2011, when the survey was conducted, 68% believed that there was more crime in the US than there was a year ago, compared to only 17% which felt that there was less, and 8% that believed that crime had basically stayed the same. Also consider the views of Americans in a separate measure of the Gallup poll, which asked respondents to rate the seriousness of the crime problem today, both in the US and in your area or your neighborhood. So the question was, overall, how would you describe the problem of crime in the United States, in your area where you live? Is it extremely serious, very serious, moderately serious, not too serious, or not serious at all? If you look at the dark green line, which represents people's perceptions about crime nationally, you'll see that well over 50% label the crime problem in the U.S. as extremely serious or very serious, and they have done for the last decade or so. Now, the question becomes, is this perception based in reality? How closely aligned are our perceptions with what's happening in crime, with respect to crime rates? This is a figure that shows the violent crime trends in the United States from 1973 to 2009, roughly the same, well, a little bit earlier from the previous graphs. And you can see that this is the number of violent victims per 1,000 population age 12 or older, the victims that experienced violence. And you can see that starting after a drive up in the early 90s, starting in about 1994, 93, 94, we see a precipitous decline in violent crime victims in the US. So basically, crime rates have been dropping for over a decade and a half in the US, and they've leveled off a little bit today, but they still continue to be much lower than they were in the 80s and before then. Now, in case you're wondering about California, trends in California mirror very closely these national trends. This isn't a figure showing violent victimization, but it is a graph showing the number of violent and property crime rates, or the violent and property crime rates over time. And it goes from 1983 to 2009, roughly the same period as the last one. And you can see that in California, at about the same time, we see a precipitous drop in property crime, and then also a drop, although not as drastic, in violent crime. So what we've experienced here in California over the last decade and a half is very similar to what's gone on nationally. Sidebar note that's quite interesting, which is that despite these record trends in declines in violent crime, and property crime for that matter, in the US, at the very same time we have seen a record rise in imprisonment. This is the imprisonment rate over the same time period, roughly 1980 to 2009. This is the number of offenders or correctional populations per 100,000 population in the United States, and you can see that it has gone directly up over time. Now, that's another talk for another day, but I think it's something that's very important and has some serious consequences. So we see these very divergent patterns with respect to crime rates and incarceration rates. But back to the decreasing crime rates. This significant reduction in crime has been coined by criminologists as the US crime drop or the Great American Crime Decline. And once criminologists got over the fact that we were completely unable to predict this decline, by the way, it was very embarrassing for criminologists who themselves did not see this decline coming, nor did they predict it, right? Once we got over that embarrassment, we began to scramble to understand what might have caused the crime drop. Why did crime rates decline during the last decade and a half? And not surprisingly, there's been absolutely no shortage of scholarly work or attention to this. These are some of the most popular books on the crime decline that have been published in the last several years. I've omitted the dozens and dozens of journal articles that speak to the why behind the crime decline. Most of this work, I would argue, offers fairly traditional explanations for why crime rates have gone down. What are some of these traditional explanations? Well, the first is rising imprisonment. I briefly flashed the graph showing how we've been incarcerating individuals in the US. There is no doubt that imprisonment, due to its incapacitative and deterrent effects, to some degree impacts crime. If you lock enough people up, crime rates will go down. People are unable to commit crime on the outside, right? What's contested, therefore, is the extent to which imprisonment rates can explain the crime drop. There is a massive debate in the literature right now about what that percentage is. But I've spoken with some scholars that do work in this area, and there seems to be some general agreement that perhaps about 25% of the reduction in crime can be attributed to incarceration. Now, whether that's worth it and whether there are collateral consequences to incarcerating so many people is another issue. But on the issue of the impact, there has been some, albeit modest, impact. A second traditional explanation deals with arguments related to the strong economy of the 90s. As we know, the economy was strong in the 90s. This led to expanded employment and reduced poverty. Now, unemployment and poverty are two of the strongest correlates of crime, so it should come as no surprise that as the economy does better and fewer people are living in poverty, fewer people are jobless, that we would expect to see crime rates decrease. Again, the extent to which this accounts for or fully accounts for the crime decline is unknown. A third argument speaks to the crack market, or the receding crack market. As many of you are aware, in the 1980s, the crack market began to boom. And around 1990 is when we see the crest of that market. About after 1990, crack began receding from US cities. And drug markets, therefore, began to shrink considerably. Well, why would this affect crime rates? Well, a large part of the criminal violence around the crack epidemic is related to individuals involved in selling drugs, and those additionally in communities where drugs are sold who are arming themselves to protect themselves. So what we see is that after the crack markets began to shrink, we see that there's falling rates of youth firearm violence as guns stopped diffusing out in the community. The need for guns as protection and as control in a drug market economy became less and less. A final traditional explanation that's been posited in a lot of the literature relates to better policing strategies that have happened over this time period. Now, there's been lots of innovation in policing, but perhaps the one that's most discussed in the literature is that related to what's called proactive policing, or zero tolerance policing, or broken windows policing. These are terms you may have read about in the news. This policing approach represents an aggressive policing approach against minor infractions with the hopes of stopping crime before it's committed. So if you can identify people that look suspicious, that are doing minor infractions, and you stop them, you could perhaps prevent them from engaging in more crime later on. Moreover, people will realize that they could be stopped for minor infractions and be deterred from committing crimes themselves out of fear and concern. Okay? This was the approach that was done in New York City, one of the first cities to report its major crime decline, under former Mayor Giuliani and former Police Commissioner William Bratton, who, as you all know, moved to LA in 2002 and implemented very similar policies for the city of LA, which under his tenure saw major declines in crime. Now, for my part, I was pretty much agnostic about this. I didn't personally do research on the crime drop. I found it interesting, but I wasn't engaging in research of my own in this area. And I read just enough to keep me abreast of new developments in the field, like if a student was going to ask me a question about it, or if I was going to talk with a reporter, that I had enough of a handle on the literature to be able to say things here and there. But I wasn't really invested in this discussion, this literature. That came to an abrupt halt on March 11th, 2006. It was a weekend day. I remember this very clearly. Maybe a Saturday, maybe a Sunday, I don't remember, but it was definitely the weekend. It was the morning. I was sitting around in my pajamas reading newspapers online like I used to do before I had a child, who doesn't let me do that anymore. And I came across a New York Times op-ed by my favorite criminologist, Robert Sampson. Now, many of you probably don't know who Robert Sampson is, but he is one of the most respected criminologists. He is the former chair of sociology department at Harvard University, the former president of the American Society of Criminology, has published hundreds of articles, one of the most cited criminologists in the country. And I came across his op-ed. Open doors don't invite criminals. And I started reading it, and he argues in this op-ed, I'll summarize it for you since the print is very small. He argues in the op-ed that criminologists, in their explanations of the crime drop, have been getting it wrong. We've been focusing our attention in the wrong area. And he said that in our attempts to explain the crime drop, we have omitted a potentially important causal factor. And we've omitted this potentially important causal factor because we are inherently biased. And I'm thinking, wow, I wonder what this is. What is he going to say? I read further and saw that Sampson was referring to immigration. His main argument in this op-ed was that crime rates in US cities had been going down over the past decade and a half, in large part because immigration to these areas or cities had been going up during the same time. And I thought, wow, that's a non-traditional argument. That's not an argument that I had anticipated in the literature or read anything about. And I read further. He based his argument on a survey that he had conducted when he was at the University of Chicago residents, several thousand residents, random survey, households in Chicago, where he found that native-born residents living in Chicago reported higher crime and victimization levels than did the foreign-born members of his survey. More interestingly, he found that regardless of whether you were born in the US or you were foreign-born, if you lived in a neighborhood that had a high concentration of immigrants, you had lower crime levels. You had a lower probability of reporting, engaging in crime or being victimized, and also the neighborhood that you lived in had lower levels of crime and violence. He also showed a very simple graph that reported data on immigration flows and average homicide trends juxtaposed with each other. And as you can see, so this is the number, the light gray shows the number of homicides from 1990 to 2004, the time period that we've been referring to here a lot. And you can see that it drops down, while at the same time, immigration flows, as represented in the hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming to this country, had been going up. Well, I just thought this was a very fascinating argument and got on email right away, still in my pajamas, and emailed Sampson and told him that I thought he did an interesting op-ed and I found it fascinating. And he must have been online because a minute later he emailed me right back and said that he had been receiving email all morning, including my email, and none of it was nice. That mine was the only email that he had received all morning long that had one nice thing to say. Well, I emailed him right back and I said, well, what are you referring to? What do you mean? And then he proceeded to forward me 15 to 20 emails that he had gotten from people. And I'm sharing one with you today. I will read it. Dear Professor Sampson, I met your article with not merely a chuckle, but guffaws, uncontrollable hysterical laughter. On what planet did you study sociology? Buck Rogers' Mongo? I have never read a collection of convoluted statistics and fabricated claptrap such as you espouse, not in my 65 years, that even began to approach the level of absurdity you puff. I don't know from where you get your alleged facts, but I lived with your precious Mexican Americans in Phoenix, Arizona, and several other large cities. I regularly witness drunken brawls, defecation in public streets, destruction of public property, violent fights with knives, guns and machetes, assault on innocents, a level of burglary and theft never before seen until Mexicans moved into the area. I say ... there because it went on for another 2 pages. But I'll bring you back to the conclusion. 6 or 8 decades ago, before criminal indigent Mexicans began to fill our cities and towns, immigrants were studious, energetic, eager to assimilate, and peaceful. They contributed to this nation. Today's immigrants, however, especially Mexicans, are generally lazy, criminal, have no intention of assimilating and do not assimilate, are uneducated beyond perhaps mid-grade school, have no trade, and are here for what they can suck from the lifeblood of our country. You and your Ivy League educated ilk live in a counterfeit utopian sphere of fantasy and lunacy. Your hot air would fill all of the balloons at the New Mexico Balloon Fest, leaving enough to launch the next space shuttle. And this was the nice one of the bunch, okay? There were about 15 to 20 other ones filled with expletives and other very demeaning comments that I would not put up on an overhead and share with you all today. I was floored. I was blown away by 2 things. One, I was blown away by the incredulity of all of these comments that he was receiving. It was absolutely unheard of for these individuals, who I realize are not a representative necessarily of public opinion more generally, but nonetheless are part of it, who could not fathom in any way, shape, or form that more immigration could lead to less crime. It was simply not even a possible scenario. Data be damned. The second was the intense level of hatred and nastiness that came across with these comments. Now, I'm used to getting all kinds of criticism of my research, as is Samson and everybody who does research. And the comments can be strong, but they're usually related to some aspect of your methodology or maybe an argument that you're making which needs to be qualified. This was a whole other level of commentary and criticism that I'm not even sure how one would address that. I was blown away because this was research done by one of the most respected criminologists in the country who was letting the data speak for themselves. I became curious, was this reaction atypical, or is this what the public perceives regarding immigration and crime in this country? And I decided to do a little investigation of my own into public opinion on immigration and crime. And I came across a very nice series of articles published by Rita Simon at George Mason University, who does work in this area. And the conclusion of my brief investigation was that regardless of time period, and by the way, regardless of immigrant group, public opinion has been that immigration and crime are causally linked. It has been, it continues to be. It doesn't matter which group we're talking about or what crimes we're talking about. This is a general finding. I thought, surely that is not the case today. We have a democratic, multicultural society that is more enlightened, perhaps more open to the possibility that this is not the case. I decided to look that up by referencing the General Social Survey. Maybe you have not heard of the General Social Survey. This is a survey that's done every few years that is a nationally representative survey of U.S. residents, of Americans, asking them about their views on a variety of things, everything from the environment to immigrants to gun control, etc. The last time they asked a question about immigration and crime was in their 2006 survey. They asked the question, does more immigrants cause higher crime rates? And I did a simple cross-tabulation on that question and found that 25%, this is a national sample, this isn't a California sample or a Texas sample or any city sample, this is nationally, 25% said that this was very likely, and another 49% said that this was somewhat likely, resulting in 3/4 of respondents believing that immigration and crime go hand in hand. Well, maybe it does. So I decided to investigate and see, what do criminologists know about immigration and crime? And this was depressing, because the minute I delved into this literature, I found that, in fact, we know that immigrants are less crime prone than the native born. This is a review piece that was commissioned by the National Institute of Justice at the turn of the century, two leading scholars in the area, Ramiro Martinez and Matt Lee, who summarized decades and decades of research on immigration and crime through a meta-analysis, and they had this to conclude. The major finding of a century of research on immigration and crime is that immigrants nearly always exhibit lower crime rates than native groups. I found articles back to the 1930s published in leading journals in our field, Social Forces, 1932, Donald Taft. Immigrants commit less crime than the native born, right? Fast forward 100 years later, 70, 80, 90 years later, and we're reaching the same conclusions. I also read that because of this major disjuncture between public perception and the empirical reality, scholars were writing about what they saw as the mythology of immigration and crime. This is a piece by John Hagan in the journal Social Problems and his colleague Alberto Poloni, where they talk about the social construction of a problem that isn't there, according to the data. Well, as you can imagine, the results of my investigation fired me up. I became concerned about how off public perception was, and how such faulty perception may be helping to create, in part, policies such as Arizona's SB 1070 and other immigration policies across the country in places like Alabama and states that were adopting copycat legislation. I decided right then and there I was going to start doing work in this area to help produce sound empirical research and get the correct message out to others about what we know about immigration and crime. And I began to see myself as an advocate, and not an advocate in the traditional sense of the word advocate, but an advocate for the use of empirical social science research to inform criminal justice policy, in this case, criminal justice policy related to immigration. So what did I do? Step one. I wanted to further test the arguments that Sampson had put forth in his op-ed. Firstly, that immigrant communities tend to have lower crime rates than non-immigrant communities. Remember, he found that for the city of Chicago, but a fair criticism is, to what extent is that finding generalizable to other cities in the US? Maybe that's a Chicago effect. We didn't know. And secondly, that immigration was responsible in part for the crime drop. Recall the figure that I put up before showing trends in homicide and trends in immigration. That chart simply shows two trends juxtaposed. It does not speak at all to the extent to which these two things are causally related. They may be correlated, but we all know that correlation does not equal causation. So I decided to undertake my own research. And I've done several studies in these areas, but I will present the results of the one study for each area that I feel best speaks to the issues that Sampson was speaking on in his op-ed. The first study I did was with a colleague at Purdue University, Scott Desmond, titled The Power of Place, Immigrant Communities, and Adolescent Violence. This was published in the Sociological Quarterly in 2009. Here we attempted to see to what extent could Sampson's argument about lower crime rates in immigrant communities be extended beyond Chicago. We used a national survey called Ad Health Survey, which tracks youth and their families over periods of time, nationally representative sample, to examine the extent to which neighborhoods with high concentrations of immigrants produced lower crime rates, had communities that had juveniles with lower crime rates in them. What was the main finding of our study? The main finding is that immigrant concentration in a community reduces adolescent violence. Youths that reside in neighborhoods with large numbers of foreign-born residents report fewer acts of violence, controlling for a host of individual level and neighborhood predictors. In other words, we found support for Sampson's research and claim outside of Chicago. In the second study, exploring the connection between immigration and violent crime rates in U.S. cities, that was done with my colleague Graham Owsey at College of William and Mary, we were interested in looking at the impact of immigration and changes in immigration on the crime drop. What was our key finding from that study? We collected decades worth of data. We used census data to look at overtime changes both in immigration and in crime. Our analyses yielded a number of key findings. First, unlike the long-held popular view that immigration is a major factor contributing to higher crime rates, our results suggest the opposite. On average, cities that experienced increases in immigration from 1980 to 2000 experienced a decrease in violent crime rates. We actually found empirical support for Sampson's argument about the crime drop. I was very excited to send him this and say, look, the comments that people are making were not so, your ideas weren't so far-fetched. In fact, this is what we find empirically. Now, if you don't want to hang your hat on one person's research, and I suggest that you don't, let me at least say a few things about the other research that was being done concurrently. This is the research of my colleagues, and by colleagues, I'm referring to other criminologists in the field that were tackling these issues at the very same time. In a paper by Jacob Stoll and his colleagues that was published in Homicide Studies in 2009, they say these findings offer general support for the notion that communities into which many Latino immigrants settle are buffered against violence, despite their relatively high levels of structural disadvantage. Scott Akins and his colleagues also report our findings indicate that recent immigration is not a meaningful predictor of homicide in Austin. This was a city-focused analysis for Austin, Texas, which is entirely consistent with previous research on immigration and crime. This is a paper by Barry Feldmeyer and his colleagues, also published in 2009. Our key findings are as follows. First, net of controls. We find that immigration has negligible or trivial effects on overall levels of homicide offending across census place in California. This was a California study. Also, another study by Ramiro Martinez, published in the field's flagship journal, Criminology, in 2010. Conventional wisdom holds that the shifting nativity composition would be associated strongly with increased levels of criminal violence, but we found that over time, more immigration means fewer overall homicides. And it goes on. I promise it won't go on for much longer. This is a paper from Tim Wadsworth, published in 2010 in Social Science Quarterly, a very well-respected journal in the field. In 2006, Robert Sampson proposed that not only have immigrants not increased crime, but they may be partly responsible for one of the most precipitous declines in crime that the United States has ever experienced. The current findings offer empirical support to this claim. Time series models suggest that the widely held belief that has motivated much of the public and political discourse about immigration and crime is wrong. In contrast, the research offers initial support for the idea that increase in immigration was partially responsible for the decrease in homicide and robbery in urban areas between 1990 and 2000. Okay? This was very similar to the study that Graham Alzey and I did, and we were actually working on it at the same time. And Jacob Stoll et al., published in Criminology in 2009, considered as a whole, our results support the hypothesis of Sampson and colleagues that the broad reductions in crime over recent years are partially attributable to increases in diversity and immigration. And I could go on and on and on, but I won't. Instead, I will just summarize this literature by quoting from an introduction to the most recent issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science journal, where Rob Sampson and John McDonald guest edited the most recent journal, list of articles in the journal, and had this to say in terms of what this collective literature has found. Taken as a whole, the articles in this volume paint a picture of profound change associated with immigration in the 21st century. Although poorer than the general U.S. population and facing considerable hardships, there is no consistent evidence that the recent waves of foreign immigration have reshaped the social fabric in negative ways, and here they also talk about including bringing violence in. If anything, the reverse might be true. So that was step one, conducting the research, producing empirical findings. Okay. Step two for me then, evidence in hand, became to educate others, especially UCI students, our future policymakers, about the important research being done in this area, because I was fairly certain they were not getting exposed to that research. They were getting exposed to public perception, though. through the news and media and that sort of thing. So last fall, I developed and taught an undergraduate class called Immigration and Crime in the Global Context, a course that had not been taught at UCI previously and probably is not being taught anywhere else in the country. I hope it is, but I'm not aware of any other institution that teaches this class, although I suspect in the years to come, institutions will be developing this course as this becomes an increasingly important issue. This course happens to be of great interest not just to UCI students, but students more broadly. At UCI, immediate interest in the course, in large part because many of our students here at UCI themselves are immigrants or are children of immigrant parents. The class was slated for 100 slots. It filled up immediately, and then I dealt with dozens and dozens of students on a wait list to get into the course. And they hadn't even taken a course with me before, so they didn't know that I was hard. And they didn't know that I grade hard. So this was purely on the topic itself, which clearly has broad appeal. The course focused on several issues. It wasn't just immigration and crime, although that was an important part of it, but it also focused on immigrants as victims, immigration and crime control, immigrants' perceptions of the crime and criminal justice system, which is obviously a part of the puzzle, public discourse and public perception on immigration and crime, public policy related to immigration and crime, and finally, human rights issues, all of which I thought were interconnected and spoke to the larger themes that I was interested in. We explored these issues in the course, not only in the US. I think it's important to have a comparative perspective here, and so we had several readings and we explored these issues in non-US locales in places like Cuba, the Mediterranean, South Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Sudan. But perhaps most importantly, among the course goals that I had, things like I want my students to develop strong critical thinking skills, was my specific goal to teach students to become smart consumers of news reports, political rhetoric, and public discussion about immigration, crime, and the law. That was built in as a fundamental aspect of the course, regardless of their personal opinions. Because of the popularity, I'm happy to report I'll be teaching this class again next quarter, and I'm hoping that it will fill up and that the students will be as interested as they were last year when I taught it. That was step 2. Step 3, I decided it was time to redirect my research efforts and focus. The consistent finding that immigration and crime do not go hand in hand, and that increases in immigration have led to actual reductions rather than increases in crime, led to my personal outrage over what I was perceiving as increasingly punitive criminal justice policy directed at immigrants. I decided to turn my focus from questions about the immigration-crime link, as I had done in my previous research. Are immigrants more crime-prone than the native-born? Do communities where immigrants reside have higher or lower crime rates? To questions about how recent immigration policies, especially criminal justice policies, are affecting immigrants themselves, immigrant families, and immigrant communities. And this was really stepping out of my comfort zone here. So this led me to contact other scholars who are doing already very good work in this area, including Ramiro Martinez, who produced the NIJ report that I flashed up earlier, as well as Marjorie Zatz, a well-known and respected scholar at Arizona State University doing important work in this area. And as a group, we collectively applied for and received funding from the National Science Foundation to bring scholars together for a 2-day workshop at Arizona State University to discuss all these issues. Okay, and this was funded in 2009, and we held the workshop in 2009, and it wasn't just sociologists and criminologists in attendance. It was explicitly interdisciplinary. We brought in economists and anthropologists. In fact, before I had even gotten here, several faculty, a faculty member and others at UCI, Susan Coutine, who had been doing very important work, I didn't know her, but thought her work was fantastic, she was brought in. So it was a very interdisciplinary team of scholars to get together and address these larger issues. Our goal was to examine issues surrounding not just immigration and crime as narrowly defined, but victimization, law, political rhetoric, and public policy. And as I said before, we held the workshop in September of 2009, And the outgrowth of that was a just recently published edited volume by myself and Marjorie and Ramiro titled Punishing Immigrants, Policy, Politics, and Injustice. This just came out. The goal of the volume was to first uncover and identify the unanticipated and hidden consequences of immigration policies and practices here and abroad. What are the impacts of these policies? What are the unintended consequences of these policies? And should we be concerned? And not just here, by the way. There's a lot of movement going on in other parts of the world, the Mediterranean, right? And so it really was not just here, but abroad. The second goal of the edited volume was to illuminate the layered realities of immigrants' lives and describe varying complexities surrounding immigration and crime law and victimization. And here our goal was to move beyond the simple questions, are immigrants more likely to engage in crime than non-immigrants? And to really flesh out all of the different layers and nuances that go on, right? We know that immigrants are not one monolithic group. They have a range of races, ethnicities, generational statuses, all kinds of differences, and there we wanted to tease out some of those important differences in our analyses. And the third goal was to situate themes 1 and 2 within a larger context of immigration and social control, particularly what we called new modes of control in a post-9/11 era. Right? So we looked at the new policies that had been in place in the last several years, in part as the frame in which a lot of these things are playing out. So almost to the day that this book was released, certainly within the month, I think this was June or July, I received the following email with the subject line, "Immigration makes California stronger nonsense. You and your research team," research in quotes, "reach the conclusions you wish to reach, not based on evidence or findings, but based on your radical left-wing politics." Is this deja vu all over again? "To pretend that there are no costs of policing our Mexican border, delivering the babies of illegal immigrants, educating them, incarcerating illegals who commit a disproportionately high number of crimes, etc., is the height of dishonesty, the height of it. But then again, you educators are the ones who have long clamored for more money for education under the false pretense that it will make things better. In fact, what you have done is dumb down education to such an extent that tens of millions of kids now attend college who are not qualified to do so. You should all be ashamed of yourselves for your dishonesty, but you are not." Well, I guess you can say I have officially made it. I forwarded my email and several others that I have received over the last several months to Rob, and we've shared a laugh. So I just want to offer a few concluding remarks here on the topic. What do we know about immigration and crime? Was immigration responsible in part for the crime decline? Now, even with the best of science, we can never really say we know anything with absolute certainty. But the remarkable consistency of findings across studies, including my own, that show there is no immigration crime link, unlike as popularly perceived, is truly astounding. It is rare that you find, especially in social science research, such a mountain of evidence in one direction. This finding is robust across individuals, across places, and even across time. Which brings me back to the crime drop. I would argue that immigration is in fact a fundamental part of the crime decline. But of course, I also acknowledge immigration isn't only or even the most important cause. Such a consistent pattern of results, I would argue, upends popular stereotypes. Among the public, policymakers, and even many academics, common expectation is that a concentration of immigrants and an influx of foreigners drive up crime rates because of the assumed propensities of these groups to commit crime, as well as the fact that they tend to settle in poor, disadvantaged communities. And yet, as research is now increasingly showing, immigrants appear in general to be less violent than their native-born counterparts, particularly when they live in other neighborhoods that have large concentrations of immigrants. It is for these reasons that I simply ask my colleagues, students, and others to rethink what they know about crime and immigration. Thank you.